I am Maya, 34 years old, and I spent a decade letting my family treat me like a ghost in my own home. Standing in the sweltering heat of my sister's engagement cookout, I watched my father point at me and tell her new Navy SEAL fiancé that I was just a guest, a coward who abandoned her squad. He expected me to lower my head while the church elders laughed. He had no idea that extending my hand to shake the commander's hand would expose a classified military secret, shatter my sister's perfect day, and cost my father his entire megachurch empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against a family that tried to bury your truth. The mid-July. Atlanta heat was unforgiving, thick and heavy with humidity, but my father's sprawling estate was packed to maximum capacity anyway. The deep rhythmic bass of classic 90s rhythm and blues vibrated from towering outdoor speakers, blending seamlessly with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the loud, boisterous laughter of local socialites. The air was thick with the scent of hickory smoke from the massive commercial grills, mixing with expensive perfumes and colognes. This was not just a simple backyard barbecue to celebrate an engagement. This was a carefully orchestrated performance, a theatrical display of status and generational wealth. My father Jeremiah was the lead pastor of one of the largest and most influential megachurches in the city, and every single event he hosted was specifically designed to remind everyone in attendance of his power, his wealth, and his flawless family image. Deacons in sharp linen suits and elder church mothers fanning themselves on the veranda all played their parts in his kingdom. I stood near the edge of the expansive limestone patio, a silent observer in a tailored dark linen suit quietly sipping a glass of iced water. Across the manicured bright green lawn, my younger sister Chloe was the undeniable center of attention. She wore a pristine white sundress, her hair perfectly styled to withstand the southern humidity, flashing a massive diamond ring that aggressively caught the late afternoon sun. Chloe was the family golden child, the one who stayed close to home, the one who played the social game exactly as Jeremiah and my mother Vivian demanded. And today, she had delivered the ultimate prize to elevate our family's social standing within the affluent African-American circles of Atlanta. She was engaged to Connor, a decorated white Navy SEAL commander. He looked every bit the military elite, standing tall and exceedingly polite beside her, shaking hands with the endless parade of church board members and politicians. My father proudly paraded in front of him. I watched the spectacle with detached, cold amusement. For years, I had been the designated disappointment in this family. When I chose to enlist in the United States Marine Corps, instead of attending the elite private university my father had explicitly selected for me, I became the ultimate black sheep. My military service was never a point of pride for them. It was viewed as a rebellion, a direct insult to their curated narrative of high society excellence. When I returned home years later and transitioned into corporate security, they dismissed me entirely, telling their wealthy friends that I was essentially a glorified mall bouncer. I had long ago stopped trying to earn a seat at their table, perfectly content to build my own life and my own business in the shadows of their glaring spotlight. But family obligations still required my physical presence at major events, even if my emotional ties to these people had been severed long ago. The music dipped slightly as Jeremiah raised his hands, his booming baritone voice carrying effortlessly over the crowd without the need for a microphone. He was completely in his element, holding court, wrapping one heavy possessive arm around Chloe and gesturing expansively toward Connor. He commanded the attention of the entire yard, weaving a grand, captivating narrative about blessed unions and the importance of bringing strong, honorable men into the family fold. Connor smiled politely, answering eager questions from the church elders, his disciplined military bearing evident in every precise movement. But as the crowd shifted and parted, Connor's sharp, highly observant gaze scanned the periphery of the patio and eventually landed squarely on me. I could see the subtle but immediate shift in Connor's posture, the way his eyes tracked the perimeter, constantly evaluating the environment, like a man who had spent his life in war zones. He leaned slightly toward Jeremiah, his voice carrying just enough over the low hum of polite conversation. I could not hear the exact question he asked, but the subtle nod toward me was absolutely unmistakable. He was asking about the solitary woman standing alone in the shadows, the one who did not fit the festive fawning mold of the rest of the eager guests. Jeremiah turned his heavy head, his eyes locking directly onto mine. A familiar cruel smirk played across his lips. This was his absolute favorite game, using me as a public punchline to instantly elevate Chloe's status. He did not bother to lower his voice. In fact, he consciously projected it, ensuring that the surrounding aunties, uncles, and church officials caught every single agonizing word. Jeremiah laughed, a deep, resonant sound that practically invited the others to join in his mockery. She is just a guest, the coward who abandoned her squad. The sheer cruelty of the lie hung heavily in the humid summer air. The older relatives chuckled, shaking their heads in practiced theatrical disappointment. I heard one of my aunts whisper loudly to a deacon about how it was a terrible shame I could not handle the pressure of the real world, how Chloe had always been the strong, dependable one. They truly believed the fabricated narrative Jeremiah had spun when I returned home to Atlanta quietly, without fanfare or public commendations. They believed I had broken under the immense weight of combat, that I had run away when things got difficult. They did not know the truth, because the truth of my service was heavily redacted in thick black ink inside secure federal archives. I did not shrink under their collective judgmental gaze. I did not lower my eyes, and I did not shift my weight uncomfortably. The years of harsh, unforgiving tactical training kicked in instantly. My posture remained rigid, my expression completely blank and unreadable. I refused to give my father the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. Instead, I stepped forward deliberately, closing the distance between the shaded edge of the patio and the center of the manicured lawn. The crowd parted slightly, the judgmental murmurs dying down as I approached the golden couple and the arrogant patriarch. Chloe immediately rolled her eyes, her face twisting into a scowl, clearly annoyed that I was stepping into her spotlight and threatening to ruin her perfect aesthetic. Jeremiah crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for me to apologize or retreat, waiting for the familiar broken submission he demanded from everyone in his orbit. I did not look at my father, and I completely ignored my sister. I stopped directly in front of Connor. I kept my eyes locked on the Navy SEAL, recognizing the quiet intensity of a man who had seen the worst parts of the world. I extended my right hand in a standard formal greeting. Connor, trained in diplomacy as much as warfare, instinctively reached out to accept the handshake. He was smiling, that polite, accommodating smile reserved for future in-laws at a barbecue. But as his hand moved toward mine, his eyes dropped to my extended arm. The tailored sleeve of my dark linen blazer had pulled back slightly, revealing the thick, jagged, unmistakable burn scar that wrapped violently around my right wrist and snaked aggressively up my forearm. It was an ugly, brutal mark, a permanent physical reminder of melting metal, scorching heat, and the unforgettable smell of burning tactical gear. The color instantly drained from Connor's face. The polite conversational smile vanished in a millisecond, replaced by an expression of absolute, unadulterated shock. His hand stopped dead mid-air, hovering just inches from mine. The expensive crystal champagne flute he held loosely in his left hand slipped completely from his fingers. It hit the hard stone patio with a sharp, explosive crack, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, sending expensive champagne splashing wildly across Jeremiah's polished leather shoes. The surrounding music seemed to fade into absolute nothingness. The entire backyard went dead silent, the guests freezing in place as they watched the decorated military commander lose his composure. Connor did not look down at the broken glass. He did not bother to apologize to my father for the mess. His body snapped backward into a stance of strict, rigid military attention, his spine going as straight as a steel rod. He stared intently at the scar on my wrist, his chest heaving once, before he slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. His square jaw trembled slightly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was tight with disbelief and a profound, overwhelming reverence. "Ma'am," he stuttered, his voice echoing loudly in the sudden suffocating silence of the sprawling estate. "Are you the Black Panther of the Marine Corps?" The silence that crashed down over the backyard was absolute and suffocating. The heavy thumping bass of the 90s rhythm and blues track cut out abruptly as my uncle stationed by the sound system fumbled with the mixer. He sensed the sudden violent shift in the atmosphere and killed the music, leaving only the hum of the cicadas and the stifling Georgia heat. Connor did not lower his hand. His salute remained crisp and rigid, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made the surrounding crowd freeze in their tracks. This was a gesture of absolute respect from a man who commanded the most elite fighting force on the planet, directed at the woman my family had spent a decade treating like dirt. Fallujah Connor said, his voice carrying clearly across the manicured lawn, slicing through the thick humidity. We study your redacted after-action reports in our tactical training. You are the Marine who went completely off the books during a compromised extraction. I took a cautious step toward me, completely oblivious to the fact that my family was staring at him like he had lost his mind. You ran back into a collapsing and burning compound, entirely alone. You dragged 4 pinned-down men out of the inferno while taking heavy enemy fire. My instructors told us you accepted a covert honorable discharge to take the fall for higher command, sacrificing your own public career to protect the mission and the lives of your unit. The crystal champagne flutes and plastic cups of sweet tea paused mid-air. The elder church mothers who just moments ago had been whispering condescendingly about my tailored dark suit and my unmarried status were now staring at me with wide, shocked eyes. The narrative they had been spoon-fed for years was suddenly incompatible with the reality standing right in front of them. I glanced past Connor to look at my father. Jeremiah stood completely frozen near the massive commercial grill. The veins in his thick neck were pulsing visibly against his starched white collar. For a decade, he had fed his massive congregation a carefully constructed lie to protect his own fragile ego. He had told all of Atlanta high society that his oldest daughter was a rebellious washout who could not handle military discipline. He had painted me as the prodigal failure to make his own strict authoritarian parenting look justified and righteous. He needed me to be the cautionary tale so his golden child could be the shining example. Now the wealthy, highly decorated military man he had handpicked for his favorite daughter was dismantling that lie piece by piece. His entire reputation was unraveling in real time, and his jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line of pure fury. He glared at me silently, demanding that I fix this, that I play my role and fall on my sword to save his pride. But I no longer took orders from him. Before Jeremiah could utter a single word to spin the situation, Chloe reacted. Her face contorted into an ugly, unfamiliar mask of rage, turning a sickly shade of green under her perfectly applied makeup. This was her engagement cookout. She was supposed to be the undisputed queen of the day, parading her high-status catch in front of the entire community. She had spent months planning this exact moment, ensuring every detail highlighted her superiority. Instead, the spotlight had violently shifted to the sister she had spent her entire life stepping on to elevate herself. The very man she was using as a trophy was currently looking at me with more respect than he had ever shown her. Chloe lunged forward. She grabbed Connor by the arm with both hands and yanked his salute down with a desperate, frantic motion. "Connor, what are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with unchecked panic and deep-seated jealousy. The polite, refined Southern belle facade instantly vanished. "Stop indulging her lies right now. She is playing you. Maya is not some legendary war hero." She spun around to face the crowd, desperately trying to snatch the narrative back before the whispers could start. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, seeking validation from the deacons and aunties who usually nodded at her every command. "She is a broke security guard. She could not even handle basic training. Dad told us the truth years ago. She was sent home because she is weak and insubordinate. You all know this." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. No one agreed with her out loud. The tension was too thick, the contrast between Connor's disciplined reverence and Chloe's hysterical outburst too stark. Chloe stepped closer to me, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me. A bullying tactic she had learned directly from watching our father silence his critics. "You always do this, Maya," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You always try to ruin my moments. You could not stand it when I graduated high school, so you ran off and enlisted just to steal my attention." You have always been jealous of me because I actually stayed and built a life. I am a successful medical spa owner, building a legacy in this city, and you are nothing but a pathetic mall cop who lives in a delusional fantasy world. Her chest heaved as she finished her tirade, waiting for me to break. She expected me to lower my head, to apologize, to shrink away, and leave the party in shame, just like I used to do when we were younger. She expected the old Maya, the scapegoat, who would swallow the abuse to keep the peace. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or break my posture. Years of tactical training and surviving in the most hostile environments on Earth had taught me one undeniable truth. The loudest person in the room is always the weakest. True power does not need to scream to be heard. I let Chloe gasp for breath. I let her embarrassment hang thick and heavy in the humid southern air. I let the silence stretch out long and agonizing until the discomfort among the guests became almost unbearable. I watched her bravado slowly curdle into insecurity as my unwavering stare pierced right through her. Then I calmly reached into my designer leather tote bag. My movements were slow, deliberate, and precise. I pulled out a sleek, matte black tablet. I tapped the screen once, waking it up. The soft glow illuminated my face as I stepped directly into my sister's personal space, forcing her to look up at me. "A broke security guard?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly leveled, dropping the temperature in the yard by 10 degrees. That is a fascinating description, Chloe, especially coming from someone who just missed her third consecutive commercial lease payment. Chloe dropped her jaw, snapping it shut a second later, as the reality of my words collided with her carefully constructed fantasy. The vibrant, glowing color that had rushed to her face just moments prior drained away completely, leaving her looking hollow, ashen, and terrified. She looked frantically around the sprawling limestone patio, her wide eyes darting from the shocked church deacons to the wealthy local socialites, who were now leaning forward, absolutely ravenous for the sudden drama. Her entire identity in Atlanta was built entirely on the illusion of boundless success and untouchable grace. She was the pristine beauty guru, the flawless entrepreneur, the ultimate prize. To have her massive financial failures aired out in front of the exact high society crowd she was so desperately trying to impress was her absolute worst nightmare. She did exactly what she always did whenever she was backed into a corner and forced to face accountability. She weaponized her tears. Chloe let out a loud, highly theatrical sob, her manicured hands flying to cover her face as her narrow shoulders began to shake violently. She stumbled backward against the custom outdoor bar, knocking over a silver tray of expensive hors d'oeuvres that clattered noisily against the stone. "You are so evil," she wailed, pointing a shaking accusatory finger directly at my chest. "You came here today just to ruin my engagement. You have always hated me. You cannot stand that Connor loves me, and that I am actually building something beautiful and successful with my life." She buried her face in her hands again, crying loudly and dramatically enough to ensure every single person in the backyard felt a sudden powerful surge of sympathy for the poor bullied bride-to-be. It was a brilliant practice performance she had perfected since we were young girls, a flawless routine designed specifically to make me look like the aggressive, bitter villain while she remained the innocent, delicate victim. Right on cue, the crowd parted again, and my mother Vivian rushed to the center of the patio to perform her role. Vivian operated like a general in her own right, her battlefield being the church pews and charity galas of Atlanta's black elite. She wore a tailored peach dress that coordinated perfectly with the lavish summer aesthetic, her heavy pearls clinking softly against her collarbone as she moved with aggressive purpose. She threw her arms around Chloe, pulling my weeping sister into a fierce, intensely protective embrace. Vivian turned her head to glare at me, her dark eyes burning with a familiar toxic hatred that I had endured for decades. "Have you lost your mind?" Vivian shouted, her voice echoing sharply off the brick walls of the grand estate. "How dare you come to your sister's celebration and spew this disgusting garbage? You have always been jealous of her, always." Vivian tightened her protective grip on Chloe, gently stroking her hair while keeping her furious, unwavering gaze locked onto my face. She used the audience, perfectly projecting her voice, so the church elders and community leaders could hear every single word of her revised, fabricated history. You could never stand to see Chloe shine, Vivian declared to the stunned yard. You purposely ruined her high school graduation by announcing your enlistment the very same morning, drawing all the attention to your foolish, reckless rebellion. You ran away to the military because you knew you could never compete with her grace, her beauty, and her intelligence. And now you come back here spreading vicious, jealous lies because your own life is miserable. Chloe owns a premier medical spa. She is a pillar of this community. And what are you? You are nothing. The words were meant to cut me down to the bone, designed to strip away my dignity and remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. Years ago, that venomous speech would have crushed my spirit. I would have internalized the deep shame, apologized profusely, just to keep the peace, and walked out the back gate, with my head hung low in defeat. But I was not that broken, eager to please girl anymore. I had been forged in literal fire. I had survived combat, betrayal, and loss. I had built a massive, untouchable empire of my own, while my family was busy playing dress up and pretending to be royalty. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, highly emotional pitch. I simply took a slow, deliberate step closer, letting the sheer crushing weight of my absolute silence amplify what I was about to say. A successful medical spa owner, I asked, my tone dripping with quiet, lethal precision. Is that why her business license was officially suspended by the state medical board on Tuesday afternoon? A collective gasp rippled rapidly through the crowd of guests. Vivian's mouth snapped shut, her righteous indignation vanishing in an instant. Chloe stopped her fake crying for a fraction of a second, her head snapping up from my mother's shoulder, her tear-stained eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. I did not look at them anymore. I turned my attention entirely to Connor. The Navy SEAL stood frozen in place, his strong jaw locked tight, his blue eyes moving rapidly between his weeping fiancé, my furious mother, and the calm, unbothered woman holding the dark screen. I extended my arm, offering the sleek black tablet directly to him. "Read it for yourself, Commander," I said smoothly. Connor hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping forward and taking the tablet from my firm grip. He looked down at the bright, high-resolution screen. I had pulled up the official state compliance report, complete with the government seal, the digital timestamps, and the glaring red-flagged violations. As Connor read the dense text, I watched his entire physical demeanor undergo a massive fundamental shift. The rigid military bearing that had momentarily softened during the festive party returned with an intense, frightening vengeance. His broad shoulders squared, his back straightened perfectly, and his eyes grew dark, stormy, and analytical. He was a man highly trained to assess critical threats and identify dangerous liabilities, and he was currently holding a massive, undeniable liability right in his hands. "This says your operating license is revoked," Connor said, his voice low, steady, and incredibly dangerous. He looked up from the screen and locked eyes with Chloe, his brow furrowed in deep confusion and a rapidly growing, simmering anger. "Chloe, this document says you have been operating without a certified medical director for 6 consecutive months. You told me your business was thriving. You told me you just expanded into a second location." Chloe lost whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. She lunged away from Vivian's protective grip, her hands desperately reaching out to snatch the tablet from Connor's strong hands. "She hacked me!" Chloe shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, grating squeal. "Connor, do not look at that. Maya is a psycho. She must have hired some underground hacker to break into my private files and doctor those documents to make me look bad. She is trying to frame me. You have to believe me, baby. She is just trying to destroy us because she is alone and bitter." She clawed frantically at Connor's arm, but he easily held the tablet up and out of her reach, his eyes continuing to scan the bottom of the digital document where the severe financial penalties and legal warnings were listed in bold black ink. His training made him immune to her panic. He was processing raw data, and the data was telling him that the woman he was about to marry was a complete fraud. I smiled. It was a cold, empty, predatory smile that sent a visible shiver through the wealthy guests standing closest to the patio. "I didn't hack anything, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing clearly and powerfully over her frantic, pathetic sobbing. "There was absolutely no need to break into your systems when the state handed me the keys through the front door." I took another confident step forward, commanding the absolute undivided attention of every single person in that sprawling backyard. My father, my mother, the church deacons, the whispering socialites, and the Navy SEAL were all hanging on to my every word, trapped in the gravitational pull of the truth. My company, Vanguard Defense and Analytics, was contracted by the State Revenue Department to conduct a forensic audit on your spa's parent company. I stated, dropping the final devastating piece of the puzzle onto the patio. We track complex financial discrepancies for federal and state agencies. You didn't just fail a routine health inspection, sister. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out. I let my eyes sweep over Vivian's horrified, trembling face and Jeremiah's pale, heavily sweating brow before locking my gaze back onto Chloe's terrified eyes. You funneled $250,000 of ghost revenue through dummy accounts to make your failing business look highly profitable to your new investors, I said, sealing her fate with absolute certainty. You committed wire fraud. The word fraud hung over the manicured lawn, like a physical weight dropping from the sky. You could hear a pin drop on the limestone patio. The extravagant Atlanta cookout had instantly transformed into an active crime scene, and I was the lead investigator holding the smoking gun. I watched the elite church deacons shift uncomfortably in their crisp linen suits. Men who usually bowed to my father's every command were now leaning away, whispering furiously behind their hands. The local socialites' women, who had just been fawning over Chloe's diamond ring, were now clutching their pearls and gripping their designer handbags, their eyes wide with scandalized horror. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the blast zone when the federal indictments dropped. Connor stood absolutely rigid, staring at the tablet in his hands as if it were a live grenade. I was processing the state seals, the timestamps, and the undeniable financial penalties listed on the screen. Chloe was hyperventilating against my mother's shoulder, her perfectly curated world collapsing into a pile of fraudulent rubble. But Jeremiah was a man who built a massive empire on controlling the narrative, and he was not about to let his kingdom fall without a brutal fight. He pushed past my mother and my weeping sister, marching directly toward me. His heavy footsteps echoed sharply on the stone. He expanded his chest, throwing his shoulders back, using his imposing physical size to try and intimidate me into submission. This was the exact same physical tactic he had used to terrorize our household for decades. I inhaled deeply and unleashed his booming pastor voice, a resonant, commanding baritone designed to rattle the stained glass windows of his megachurch and demand absolute obedience from his congregation. "That is enough!" Jeremiah roared, the sheer volume of his voice making a few of the nearby guests flinch physically. He thrust a thick, accusing finger directly at my face. "I will not have you march onto my estate and spew these venomous lies. You are trespassing on my property, Maya. I demand that you turn around, walk out those gates, and never show your face in this family again." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground, my posture relaxed, but completely unyielding. My refusal to cower infuriated him further. He realized quickly that shouting me down was not going to work, and more importantly, he saw the skeptical, questioning faces of his most wealthy church donors watching his every move. He needed to pivot. He needed to spin the crisis before the whispers turned into a stampede for the exits. Jeremiah smoothly transitioned from the outraged, betrayed father to the composed, benevolent community leader. He physically turned his back on me, entirely dismissing my presence, and opened his arms wide to address his bewildered guests. He plastered on a warm, reassuring smile, executing a masterclass in manipulation. "Brothers and sisters, friends, please," Jeremiah announced smoothly, his tone dropping to a soothing pastoral cadence. "Do not be alarmed by this ugly, jealous display. You all know my eldest daughter. You know her troubled history. She has always struggled with her sister's success." He let out a heavy theatrical sigh, shaking his head as if he were carrying a massive burden of parental sorrow. "What Maya has so dramatically misrepresented as fraud is nothing more than a private family financial matter." I watched him weave the lie with a sickening level of expertise. He paced the patio, slowly making direct eye contact with the deacons, ensuring they were absorbing his carefully crafted narrative. Chloe's medical spa experienced a slight downturn during the last quarter. Jeremiah explained smoothly, his hands gesturing in open, honest motions. Like many young, ambitious business owners, she needed a temporary bridge. Vivian and I authorized a simple family loan to help our daughter keep her doors open and her employees paid. It was a private transfer of funds from our accounts to hers. There is no missing medical director. There is no wire fraud. There is only a jealous sister who gained access to private banking documents and decided to twist the numbers to ruin a beautiful engagement. The lie was so seamless, so perfectly delivered, that I actually saw the tension begin to drain from the yard. The socialites visibly relaxed their shoulders, dropping as they bought into the comfortable, familiar story of a supportive, wealthy father helping his entrepreneurial daughter. Chloe peeked out from behind Vivian's shoulder, her tears magically stopping as she realized our father was successfully putting the fire out. But Jeremiah was not finished. He needed to completely destroy my credibility. He needed to make me the ultimate villain so that no one would ever question his actions again. He elevated his speech, transitioning seamlessly into a full sermon right there on the patio. He invoked the most sensitive, powerful themes he could muster, weaponizing our culture and our community against me. We are a proud people, Jeremiah preached, his voice vibrating with righteous conviction. We understand the vital importance of building and maintaining generational wealth in the Black community. We know how hard it is to build a legacy in this city. When one of our own stumbles, we do not throw them to the wolves. We do not call the state auditors. We lift them up. We pull our resources together. We invest in our children's futures. He spun around to face me again, his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant fire. He pointed a finger at my chest, condemning me in front of everyone. We protect our own in this house, Maya. We build our community up. Something you know nothing about. You ran away from your responsibilities. You abandoned your bloodline just like you abandoned your military unit. You have no loyalty, no honor, and no understanding of what it means to truly sacrifice for your family. The older relatives actually murmured their agreement, nodding along with his sermon. The gaslighting was operating at maximum efficiency. He had effectively painted me as an outsider, a traitor to my own family and my own people, all while framing his blatant financial crimes as an act of noble paternal love. He stood tall, his chest puffed out, waiting for me to break under the immense crushing weight of his public condemnation. He expected me to flee. I just stared at him. I let the final echoes of his self-righteous speech fade completely into the humid summer air. I did not scream defensively. I did not rush to justify my military service. I did not let his toxic words penetrate my armor. Instead, I slowly crossed my arms over my chest, planting my feet firmly on the stone patio. A sharp, icy amusement spread across my face. I let a slow, terrifying smile touch the corners of my mouth. A family loan. I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity that sliced right through his pastoral authority. That is a truly fascinating story, Dad. A beautiful sermon. I tilted my head, locking my eyes entirely onto his, stripping away every ounce of his power with one simple, unanswerable command. Tell me, Dad, exactly which family account did you draw that $250,000 from? Vivian sneered, stepping right into the trap I had spent 3 excruciating minutes laying for her. She practically floated across the limestone patio on a wave of pure, unfiltered arrogance, her diamond-encrusted cross necklace catching the bright afternoon light as she held her chin high. She looked around at the assembled crowd of church deacons, local business leaders, and whispering relatives, eager to deliver what she believed would be the crushing blow to my reputation. "We used the generational wealth your grandmother left behind," Vivian announced proudly, her voice ringing out across the yard like a triumphant church bell. "We agreed as a family that Chloe deserved it because she actually stayed home and built a community unlike you who ran off to play soldier." She smoothed down the front of her tailored peach dress, adjusting her stance to ensure everyone in attendance could see her posture of absolute, unyielding moral superiority. In her mind, she was delivering a sermon on righteous family values and tough love. She truly believed that citing my absence and my military service would instantly turn every single person in this backyard against me. Several older family members in the front row nodded in eager rhythmic agreement. In their traditional conservative eyes, Chloe had played the expected game perfectly. She had stayed in Atlanta, attended the right social gatherings, smiled at the right galas, and brought home a handsome, high-status military fiancé. She was visible, submissive, and easily managed. To them, my decision to enlist in the United States Marine Corps was not an honorable sacrifice, but a selfish rejection of my family's social standing. They believed that generational wealth belonged exclusively to the children who stayed within the fold to polish the family legacy, not the daughter who dared to forge her own path in the dust of distant battlefields. I let the oppressive silence settle over the patio. I dropped my shoulders slightly, allowing my posture to soften just enough to give them the illusion that their harsh words were finally breaking my spirit. I squeezed my eyes shut for a brief second, breathing in deeply, playing the role of the defeated, humiliated black sheep to absolute perfection. So I said, keeping my voice intentionally strained, ensuring it carried far enough for every deacon and auntie to hear every syllable clearly. You and Dad authorized the transfer of grandmother's specific trust fund directly to Chloe's business accounts. Vivian smirked, her eyes flashing with a dark, cruel satisfaction as she watched me supposedly crumble under her righteous authority. Jeremiah stepped up beside her, placing a heavy, possessive hand on her shoulder, his chest puffed out like a king defending his throne. They believed they had effectively backed me into a corner, using the age-old defense of parental discretion and family loyalty. Yes, we did, Vivian responded proudly, nodding her head with absolute conviction. Because she is the future of this family, and we have the right to distribute our legacy as we see fit. The entire yard seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see if I would burst into tears, offer a desperate apology, or quietly slip out the back gate in utter shame. Instead, I stood up completely straight. The artificial slump in my shoulders vanished instantly, replaced by the rigid, formidable posture forged in the grueling heat of military combat. The artificial look of defeat melted off my face, replaced by a cold, sharp, unbothered smile that sent an immediate chill through the sweltering, humid air. I slowly reached back into my designer leather tote bag. My fingers closed around a thick, crisp, heavily sealed manila legal folder that had been sitting quietly at the bottom of my bag all afternoon. I pulled it out deliberately, letting the bold red confidential stamp on the front face the staring crowd. "That is really strange, Mom," I said, my voice dropping an octave into a lethal crystal-clear register as I aggressively ripped open the official wax seal. Because grandmother did not leave a generic family fund. I pulled the certified legal document from the heavy manila envelope, the crisp sound of the thick parchment cutting sharply through the humid afternoon air. The embossed gold seal of the state gleamed under the intense Georgia sun, an undeniable beacon of absolute verified truth. I did not wave the paper around frantically. I did not shove it into my father's face to demand an apology. I moved with the calm, methodical precision of a tactical operator disarming a highly volatile threat. I stepped past my father's frozen frame and walked directly toward the custom outdoor bar where the church leadership had congregated. I handed the first copy of the trust document to Deacon Washington, a man who had spent 30 years as a senior forensic accountant before taking over the megachurch treasury. I handed the second copy to Deacon Rollins. Both men had just been nodding along to my father's sermon about generational wealth and family loyalty. Now, I watched their eyes dart rapidly across the bold legal print, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to profound, unadulterated horror. Grandmother left an irrevocable trust entirely in my name. I stated, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity that commanded the absolute attention of every single person on the patio. A trust which I legally deferred until my 34th birthday. You didn't authorize a family loan, Dad. I let the words settle over the crowd, watching the devastating reality of the situation click into place for the financial professionals reviewing the paperwork. I had provided not just the original trust mandate, but the complete, undeniable paper trail. The documents showed the exact wire transfers, the routing numbers, and the digital timestamps. More importantly, they showed the fraudulent release forms submitted to the bank. Grandmother had specifically locked Jeremiah out as a trustee, because she knew his insatiable obsession with funding a lavish high society lifestyle would eventually drain her hard-earned estate. She knew I was the only one in the family who possessed the discipline to respect the capital. The color completely drained from Jeremiah's face. The deep, rich brown of his skin went pale, taking on a sickly ashen hue. The booming, authoritative posture he had maintained just moments ago deflated like a punctured tire. He opened his mouth to deliver another booming excuse to weave another brilliant pastoral lie, but the sheer weight of the physical evidence choked the words right out of his throat. He looked at Deacon Washington seeking an ally, but the deacon took a very deliberate, physical step backward, holding the documents away from his body as if they were contagious. Vivian stumbled backward, her designer heels scraping awkwardly against the limestone patio. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching her heavy string of pearls as if she needed them to breathe. Her meticulously crafted image as the flawless, virtuous matriarch of Atlanta's elite black society was disintegrating in front of her most important peers. She looked desperately at her husband, silently pleading for him to fix it, to deploy his usual charisma and shut me down. But Jeremiah was paralyzed. The flock was realizing the shepherd had been shearing them blind. I turned my attention away from my parents and locked eyes directly with my sister. Chloe was trembling, her pristine white sundress suddenly looking like a prison uniform. "You and Dad forged my signature to drain $250,000 of my money," I said, my tone completely devoid of any familial warmth. "You bypassed the third-party executor by fabricating a terminal medical emergency, claiming I was incapacitated, and routed the entire $250,000 directly into your failing business accounts to cover your commercial leases and luxury car payments. The FBI doesn't call that a family loan. They call it identity theft." The backyard erupted into absolute chaos. The polite, hushed whispers of the wealthy socialites transformed into an outright deafening uproar. Aunts who had just been praising Chloe's business acumen were now shouting across the manicured lawn, dropping their plates of barbecue into the grass. Uncles who had been patting Jeremiah on the back and laughing at his cruel jokes about my military service were now physically backing away from him, treating the man like an active explosive. Nobody wanted to be caught standing in the blast radius of a federal financial crime. The tight-knit protective facade of our prominent family had been violently ripped away, exposing the rot underneath. Chloe realized she was completely cornered. The immaculate illusion of the successful self-made medical spa owner was dead. The narrative of the perfect, dutiful golden child was shattered beyond repair. She had no money, no business license, and now no defense against a felony fraud charge. Panic consumed her entirely. She needed a shield, a savior, someone whose unassailable status could protect her from the consequences of her own actions. She spun around, her white dress flaring, and lunged desperately for Connor. Chloe grabbed Connor's strong hands, her manicured acrylic nails digging fiercely into his skin as she tried to pull him down to her eye level. She was crying hysterically now, real panic-stricken tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless airbrushed makeup. "She is lying! Connor," she shrieked, her voice cracking in absolute desperation. "Please look at me, baby. You have to tell them she is lying. Maya fabricated all of this because she hates us. She is trying to frame me to ruin our engagement. Tell them you believe me." Connor did not comfort her. He did not pull her into a warm, protective embrace or offer soft words of reassurance. He stood as immovable as a mountain. He looked down at the certified bank records, the state compliance reports, and the trust documents I had just handed him. His jaw was tightly clenched, a dark, turbulent storm brewing in his eyes as his military training processed the undeniable reality of the situation. Chloe's manicured acrylic nails dug so deeply into Connor's forearm that the fabric of his crisp summer shirt creased under the strain. She was weeping, but there was no sorrow in her cries, only the feral panic of a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. She shook him desperately, trying to force his eyes away from the certified state audit and the bank records I had just handed over. When she realized the financial lie was completely dead in the water, she pivoted to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal. She weaponized her own insecurities, projecting them entirely onto me in a display so ugly and visceral that even my mother took a hesitant step back. "She is just jealous!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the brick facade of our father's sprawling estate. She pointed a trembling finger at my face, her chest heaving as she spat out every toxic thought she had harbored since childhood. Look at her, Connor. She is a bitter, lonely, miserable woman. She has always been obsessed with ruining my life because she knows she will never be me. She cannot stand the fact that I am the one wearing this ring. She cannot stand that I found a high-status, successful white man who actually treats me like a queen while she spent her best years sweating in the dirt playing soldier with a bunch of grunts. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the heavy, humid Georgia air. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of church deacons and wealthy socialites. For years, Chloe had played the role of the perfect, pious, humble daughter of the city's most respected megachurch pastor. Now backed into a corner with her felony fraud exposed, the mask had completely melted off. She was showing the entire yard the shallow, calculating, and viciously insecure woman she truly was. She thought that playing the victim, that elevating Connor's race and military status, while degrading my own service, would somehow activate his protective instincts. She fundamentally misunderstood the man she was trying to marry. Connor did not comfort her. He did not pull her into his chest, and he certainly did not leap to her defense. As a Navy SEAL commander, his entire existence was governed by a strict, unshakable code of honor, loyalty, and absolute integrity. He had built his life and his career on the foundation of trust, leading men into the darkest, most dangerous corners of the globe, knowing that a single lie could cost dozens of lives. He looked down at the woman clawing at his arm, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unfiltered disgust. He did not yell. He did not lose his temper or match her frantic, hysterical energy. His movements were slow, deliberate, and devastatingly final. He reached over with his free hand and grasped Chloe's wrists. He did not hurt her, but his grip was unyielding as he physically pried her manicured fingers off his arm one by one. He pushed her hands away and took a very distinct, measured step backward, putting physical distance between his decorated uniform and her fraudulent existence. "Connor, please," Chloe begged, her voice dropping into a pathetic, breathless whimper as she stumbled forward, reaching for him again. "You have to believe me. Maya is making all of this up to destroy us. She forged these papers." Connor held up a hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. The look in his steel blue eyes was so incredibly cold that it practically lowered the temperature of the sweltering patio. He looked down at the heavily stamped state compliance reports and the banking documents bearing my forged signature. He processed the information with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a tactical commander assessing a critical threat. Then he raised his head and addressed the entire yard, his voice carrying the sharp, undeniable authority of a man who commanded the most elite fighting force on the planet. "You think this is just about your sister being jealous of an engagement ring?" Connor said, his voice dangerously quiet, slicing through the tension like a freshly sharpened blade. "You think you can just smile and cry and blame her, and I will just blindly follow along because I am supposed to protect you?" Chloe nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect airbrushed makeup. "Yes, yes, exactly. She is just trying to tear us apart, baby. We cannot let her win. I hold a top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information clearance." Connor continued, completely ignoring her pleas, his tone growing harder with every word. "I am a commander in the United States Navy Special Warfare Development Group. Did you honestly believe that marrying me would just involve picking out floral arrangements and tasting wedding cake?" Chloe blinked, her frantic sobbing hitching in her throat as a new, unfamiliar wave of terror washed over her face. My father Jeremiah, who had been silently praying for a miracle to save his reputation, suddenly looked completely nauseous. When an officer of my rank declares an intention to marry, the federal government does not just send a congratulatory card. Connor stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. My chain of command initiated a mandatory deep dive background check on my future spouse. They look into everything: your associates, your travel history, your digital footprint, and most importantly, your finances. They need to ensure that the person I am binding myself to is not a security risk, a liability, or someone susceptible to blackmail. The church elders standing near the custom grill were staring at Connor in stunned silence. My mother, Vivian, had her hands clamped over her mouth, her knuckles completely white. They were all realizing simultaneously that the United States military had been quietly auditing their golden child for weeks. "A month ago, the investigators pulled me into a secure briefing room," Connor said, taking another step away from Chloe, treating her like an active hostile threat. "They flagged massive financial anomalies in your business accounts, Chloe. They found dummy corporations. They tracked aggressive, unexplained cash injections that did not match your reported revenue streams. They showed me banking irregularities that pointed directly to wire fraud and money laundering." Chloe's knees physically buckled. She swayed, nearly collapsing onto the limestone patio, but Vivian rushed forward to catch her by the shoulders, holding her upright. Vivian looked at Connor with wide, desperate eyes, but Connor did not even acknowledge my mother's presence. His focus was entirely on the woman who had spent the last year lying to his face. "I fought with my commanding officer over it." Connor revealed the deep residual anger bleeding into his steady voice. "I sat in that briefing room, and I put my stars on the table for you. I defended your honor. I told the investigators that they had to be mistaken. I swore up and down that my fiancé was an honest, hardworking entrepreneur who built her medical spa from the ground up. I told them it had to be an administrative error, a mistake made by a sloppy accountant, or a glitch in the state revenue system. I staked my entire professional reputation and my security clearance on your integrity." Connor lifted the thick stack of audit reports and trust documents I had provided. He gripped the papers so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He looked from the documents to Chloe, his expression shifting from disgust to profound, irreversible betrayal. "I spent 30 days fighting the federal government to protect your name because I could not figure out where the sudden influx of phantom money came from." Connor said, his voice dropping into a lethal quiet register that commanded the absolute attention of every single guest in the sprawling backyard. "But Maya just gave me the missing puzzle piece." Connor held the certified banking records up to the bright Georgia sun. His voice was methodical and icy, stripping away the last remnants of the festive cookout. He spoke not like a man addressing his bride-to-be, but like a tactical officer delivering a post-mission casualty report. "You came to me last month bragging about a miraculous angel investor." Connor said, his words landing like physical blows. "You told me a private benefactor saw your vision and wired you the exact capital you needed to secure that second commercial lease in Buckhead. I believed you. I celebrated with you. But the date on this forged bank transfer matches the exact day you signed that new lease. There was no angel investor. You stole $250,000 from your own sister." Chloe stood paralyzed. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The wealthy socialites and church deacons surrounding us were completely silent, captivated by the sheer magnitude of the destruction happening in front of them. "Do you have any idea what you almost did to me?" Connor asked, his chest expanding as he took a step toward her, his shadow falling over her pristine white sundress. "If I had signed a marriage license with you, my finances would have been legally bound to yours. The Department of Defense would have flagged the wire fraud during my next clearance review. They would have looked at the dummy corporations and the stolen trust funds, and they would have labeled me a co-conspirator." Connor shook his head, absolute revulsion twisting his handsome features. "The United States Navy would have stripped me of my top-secret clearance instantly. I would have been removed from my command. I would have faced a court-martial and a dishonorable discharge. You were going to let me walk blindly into a federal financial crime just so you could keep playing pretend in front of your friends." The undeniable truth of his words finally shattered the last pillar of Chloe's delusion. The reality of the prison time, the public humiliation, and the loss of her ultimate trophy fiancé crashed down on her all at once. Her knees physically gave out. Chloe dropped straight down onto the hard limestone patio. The impact scuffed her knees and ruined the hem of her expensive designer dress. But she did not care. She collapsed into a pathetic sobbing heap right at Connor's leather shoes. She reached out with both hands, grabbing the fabric of his trousers, weeping with a wild, primal desperation. "Connor, please!" she wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the manicured lawn. "I was desperate. The business was failing, and I was so terrified of losing everything. I wanted to be perfect for you. I wanted to be the successful woman you thought I was. We can pay it back. I will fix it. Please do not leave me. I love you." She buried her tear-stained face against his leg, crying so loudly that it made several of the older church mothers look away in second-hand embarrassment. Chloe had spent her entire life standing on my neck to elevate herself, projecting an image of untouchable grace. Now she was crawling on the ground, begging a man who was looking at her like she was radioactive waste. Before Connor could step away from her grasp, my mother intervened. Vivian could not stand to watch her ultimate social triumph slip through her fingers. A marriage to a decorated military commander was the crown jewel she needed to cement her status among Atlanta's black elite. She rushed forward, her heavy pearls swinging, and plastered on the most sickeningly sweet diplomatic smile she could muster. "Connor, sweetheart, let us just take a deep breath," Vivian said, using the exact same soothing, manipulative tone she used to placate angry church donors. She reached out, attempting to place a comforting hand on his broad shoulder, but he swiftly leaned out of her reach. Vivian kept her fake smile pinned to her face, lowering her voice as if trying to bring him in on a secret. "This is just a terrible, unfortunate misunderstanding over some tangled paperwork. Jeremiah and I have deep pockets and very powerful connections in this city. We can make the state audit go away. We will reimburse Maya's trust fund by tomorrow morning, and we will pay whatever fines the state demands. Let us step inside the air-conditioned study, have a glass of sweet tea, and handle this quietly like family. We can make all of this disappear." Connor stared at my mother, his eyes narrowing in absolute disbelief. He looked from Vivian's desperate, calculating smile down to Chloe, who was still weeping on the patio stones. "Your mother thinks a felony wire fraud investigation is just a paperwork error that can be bribed away." "Hey," Connor said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unfiltered disgust. He did not yell, but the quiet intensity of his words cut deeper than any shout could have. "That tells me exactly how you were raised, Chloe. It tells me everything I need to know about the moral compass of this family." He looked down at the sobbing woman at his feet. He did not offer her a hand up. He did not soften his gaze. "I don't marry into lies." Connor stated the finality in his tone, echoing across the silent backyard. "And I certainly don't marry thieves." Chloe let out a breathless, agonizing gasp. "Take the ring off," Chloe, Connor demanded. She froze, looking up at him through her ruined makeup. She clutched her left hand to her chest, protecting the massive diamond as if it were her own beating heart. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head frantically. "No, Connor, please do not do this. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. Take it off." He repeated, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. Trembling violently, Chloe slowly reached for her left hand. Her acrylic nails clicked against the platinum band. She struggled to pull it over her knuckle, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it onto the stone patio. The massive diamond caught the bright Georgia sun one last time as she slid it off her finger. She held it out to him, her hand suspended in the air, offering up the last remaining piece of her shattered fantasy. Connor reached down and plucked the ring from her palm. He did not look at it. He simply shoved the diamond deep into the pocket of his trousers. He stepped back, freeing himself completely from her space. Then Connor turned away from my weeping sister and my horrified mother. He turned directly to me. He did not offer me an apology for my family's behavior, knowing I did not need his pity. Instead, he stood tall, locked eyes with me, and delivered a crisp, deeply respectful military nod. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement between two people who understood the heavy price of honor. I gave him a single subtle nod in return. Connor turned his back on the sprawling estate. He walked straight through the crowd of gaping deacons and stunned socialites, his strides long and purposeful. The heavy wrought iron gates of the backyard swung open for him, and he marched out without ever looking back. The loud metallic thud of the gate closing shut behind him sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood. The sound broke the spell over the patio. Chloe let out a visceral, blood-curdling scream. She collapsed completely onto the grass, thrashing and clawing at the manicured lawn. Her perfect white sundress was stained with dirt and spilled champagne. She pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face, her voice tearing through the humid air. "You ruined my life," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her face a mask of pure hatred and despair. "This is all your fault. You took everything from me." The agonizing sound of Chloe screaming, thrashing against the manicured grass of our family estate was entirely eclipsed by the deafening silence of the surrounding crowd. The wealthy socialites and powerful church deacons, who had spent the last hour praising my father's pristine family, were now staring at the wreckage in absolute horror. The golden child's engagement was completely destroyed. The massive financial theft was exposed for everyone to see. The pristine, untouchable reputation of the most powerful megachurch family in Atlanta was bleeding out right there on the limestone patio. I watched the exact moment my father realized his kingdom was collapsing. Jeremiah stood frozen near the custom outdoor kitchen, his eyes darting frantically across the yard. He watched Deacon Washington backing away, while furiously typing a message into his phone. He saw the elder church mothers whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting from the sobbing Chloe on the ground to the certified trust documents still sitting on the patio table. For a man with deep pathological narcissism, the loss of public adoration is a fate far worse than death. Jeremiah had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of divine authority and untouchable generational wealth. He had built his megachurch from a modest congregation into a massive multi-million-dollar enterprise by portraying himself as the ultimate moral compass of the community. Now the flock was watching the shepherd be exposed as a common thief. The shock on his face rapidly melted away, replaced instantly by a dark, violent, and desperate rage. He could not attack the Navy SEAL who had just walked out the gates. He could not attack the state auditors who had uncovered the wire fraud. He needed a target, a place to direct all of his explosive fury. As always, he chose his designated scapegoat. He chose me. Jeremiah marched across the patio, his heavy, aggressive footsteps echoing loudly against the stone. He shoved past my mother, completely ignoring Chloe, who was still weeping on the grass. He closed the distance between us in seconds, invading my personal space with the aggressive, overbearing physical intimidation he had used to terrorize our household for decades. He stopped mere inches from my face. He puffed his broad chest out, using every inch of his towering height to try and force me into submission. I could smell the sharp, expensive scent of his custom cologne mixed heavily with the sour, metallic odor of his own nervous sweat. His eyes were wide and unblinking, burning with a toxic, unfiltered hatred. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" Jeremiah hissed, his voice vibrating with a low, dangerous intensity that he intended only for me to hear. But the yard was so quiet that his words carried effortlessly to the lingering guests. "You think you have won because you brought a few pieces of paper to a cookout," he sneered, his upper lip curling into a snarl. "You think you can march into my home, disrespect your mother, destroy your sister's future, and humiliate me in front of my own congregation without consequences." I did not take a single step backward. I did not avert my gaze, nor did I cross my arms defensively. I stood my ground perfectly, my spine straight, meeting his furious glare with eyes as cold and empty as a frozen lake. This physical intimidation tactic might have worked when I was a terrified teenager trying to earn his impossible approval, but it was absolutely useless against a 34-year-old combat veteran. I had stood face to face with actual warlords. A desperate man in a sweat-soaked linen suit screaming on a patio meant absolutely nothing to me. My lack of fear only enraged him further. If physical presence could not break me, he would resort to the ultimate weapon he possessed. He would use the full crushing weight of his social and religious empire. He raised his voice, abandoning all pretense of a private conversation, ensuring that the wealthy elites and church leadership heard every single threat. He wanted to make a public example out of me. "I built this city!" Jeremiah roared, throwing his arms wide to encompass the sprawling estate and the invisible empire beyond its walls. "I sit on the board of every major charitable foundation in Atlanta. The mayor answers my phone calls on the first ring. I control the spiritual and financial direction of the most powerful Black congregation in the South. You are a fool if you think a minor auditing company can stand against the influence of my church." He stepped closer again, his voice dropping into a guttural, venomous shout. "I will personally see to it that you are completely excommunicated from our community. I will stand at my pulpit this Sunday, and I will brand you a liar, a traitor, and a fraud. I will call every single business leader, every politician, and every corporate executive in my network by morning. I will make sure no one in our culture or the local business community ever signs a contract with your company again. He pointed a heavy, trembling finger directly between my eyes, delivering what he believed was the ultimate inescapable death sentence. You are dead in this town, Maya. I will wipe your name from every pulpit and boardroom in this state. You will lose everything you have built, and when you are entirely bankrupt and alone, do not dare come crawling back to my gates begging for mercy. His chest heaved as he finished his tirade. He stared down at me, waiting for the panic to set in. He waited for the realization of my impending social and financial ruin to crush my spirit. He expected me to drop to my knees just like Chloe and beg for his forgiveness. He expected me to surrender. I let his heavy, aggressive breathing fill the silence. I looked at the veins bulging in his neck, the frantic, desperate energy radiating from his pores. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, I lifted my left wrist. I did not look at the jagged burn scar that had so deeply shocked Connor. I looked at the face of my custom platinum watch. The sleek hands indicated it was exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The timing was absolutely flawless. I lowered my wrist and looked my father dead in the eye. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic shouting. "You are right about one thing, Dad," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, icy calm that made him blink in sudden confusion. "I really do know nothing about begging for mercy." Right on cue, the heavy wrought iron gates at the far end of the sprawling backyard swung open with a loud metallic groan. The sound was so sharp and commanding that Jeremiah physically jumped, spinning around to see who dared interrupt his moment of ultimate authority. The church deacons, the whispering aunties, and my mother all turned their heads toward the entrance. Walking through the gates with the unstoppable, commanding presence of a localized hurricane was my chief operating officer and lead corporate attorney, Renee. Renee was a striking, brilliantly sharp African-American woman who commanded respect the second she entered any room. She was dressed in a flawlessly tailored, vivid crimson suit that stood out aggressively against the soft pastel garden party aesthetic of my father's cookout. Her heels clicked sharply and rhythmically against the stone pathway, sounding like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of my father's reign. She did not look at the weeping bride on the grass. She did not spare a single glance for the horrified socialites or the murmuring church elders. She walked with aggressive, absolute purpose, her gaze locked entirely on me. Clutched tightly in her arms was a fresh, incredibly thick stack of sealed manila folders. The crowd instinctively parted for her. The senior deacons actually stepped backward, moving out of her way, as she marched directly onto the center of the limestone patio. The atmosphere in the yard shifted violently from chaotic family drama to the cold, clinical reality of a corporate execution. Renee stopped right beside me, completely ignoring Jeremiah's towering, furious presence. She turned to me, her expression perfectly composed and strictly professional. Without a single word of greeting or hesitation, she handed the heavy stack of legal files directly into my waiting hands. I took the thick stack of manila folders from Renee. The heavy weight of the files settling into my hands sounded like a judge dropping a wooden gavel in a dead silent courtroom. I did not need to open them or verify their contents. I already knew exactly what was printed on every single page. I turned my attention away from Renee and focused my gaze back on the whispering crowd, looking directly at the very deacons and local politicians my father had just commanded to destroy my life. "Dad, you cannot ruin my reputation in this town," I said, my voice carrying a smooth, unshakable authority that easily overpowered the nervous murmurs of the wealthy guests. "You spent the last decade telling these people I was a broken, traumatized soldier bouncing from one dead-end job to another. You convinced yourself I was working minimum wage security, because acknowledging anything else would mean admitting you could not control my destiny. But you severely underestimated the daughter you tried to throw away." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the limestone patio, forcing Jeremiah to physically step back to maintain his space. "You see, Vanguard Defense does not just do basic cyber audits for failing strip mall spas," I announced, ensuring my words reached the furthest corners of the sprawling estate. "We do not just run simple background checks or stand outside retail stores. We are a premier federal contractor." My company provides armed tactical security for the governor of this state. We manage the digital infrastructure and financial compliance for half the municipal buildings in Atlanta. We hold the security contracts for the entire downtown banking district. I let that massive reality sink into the minds of the elite socialites and business owners standing on the grass. The sheer scale of my enterprise was crashing down on them. The woman they had spent the entire afternoon sneering at was actually the woman quietly guarding their municipal infrastructure. And as of 6 months ago, I continued lowering my voice to a lethal piercing register. My firm manages the private physical security and the strict financial compliance oversight for the very megachurch you preach at. The backyard went absolutely frantic. Deacon Washington actually dropped his porcelain plate of barbecue. It shattered against the stone, but nobody even flinched at the noise. The elder church mothers gasped, clutching their chests and exchanging horrified, wide-eyed glances. The local politicians who had been laughing at Jeremiah's jokes just 20 minutes earlier were now staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and sudden desperate respect. In the elite circles of Atlanta, power is the only currency that truly matters. And I had just revealed that I held the keys to the entire city. Jeremiah realized his supreme authority was evaporating into thin air. The absolute control he wielded over his congregation was slipping right through his sweating fingers. His mind could not process the fact that the scapegoat he had bullied for a lifetime was currently standing over him as an untouchable corporate titan. The psychological break of a pure narcissist losing his audience is a violent thing to witness. He let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a forced grating and entirely unnatural sound that grated against the heavy humidity of the afternoon. "Look at her!" Jeremiah shouted, waving his large hands dismissively in the air as he turned to face the terrified deacons. "Look at the delusions of a broken mind. This is exactly what I have been talking about all these years. She is standing in my backyard, making up absolute fairy tales to make herself sound important." He pulled a crisp white handkerchief from his breast pocket and aggressively wiped the thick beads of sweat rapidly forming on his forehead. The immaculate, pristine image of the unbothered megachurch pastor was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, panicked energy of a cornered predator. "Vanguard defense," he mocked, practically spitting the words out as he paced the patio. "You expect us to believe that a disgruntled, discharged veteran with a bad attitude is running state security contracts. She is bluffing. She is a bitter, jealous woman trying to sound powerful because her sister found a good man, and she has absolutely nothing. Do not listen to a single word of this madness. She has no authority over our church. She has no access to our financial records. I am the senior pastor of that congregation, and I say she is a fraud." He glared at the deacons, silently demanding their unwavering loyalty. He expected them to fall in line, to nod their heads, and help him escort the crazy daughter off the premises. He needed them to validate his reality. But nobody moved. Nobody agreed with him. The undeniable presence of the certified state audit I had just handed Connor, combined with the towering, intimidating presence of my chief operating officer, made Jeremiah's frantic denial look incredibly pathetic. Renee did not wait for Jeremiah to finish his desperate, sweating performance. She stepped smoothly past me, placing herself directly in the line of fire. She moved with the cold, calculated precision of a corporate assassin who had never lost a courtroom battle in her entire career. Her tailored crimson suit stood out like a warning flag against the manicured green lawn. She fixed her dark, analytical eyes on my father. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her tone was perfectly composed, sharply articulated, and naturally amplified in the dead quiet yard. "She isn't bluffing," Reverend Renee stated, using his religious title with a heavy, dripping layer of irony that made several church members wince. Renee reached out and tapped the top manila folder resting in my hands. Her perfectly manicured fingernail hit the heavy cardstock with a sharp, definitive click. Vanguard Analytics was brought in by the Regional Church Council to conduct a routine security and financial compliance review of all affiliated properties. Renee explained, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of absolute legal authority. "In fact, my team has been quietly auditing the church's brand new community center for the past 3 weeks." Jeremiah froze. The white handkerchief dropped from his trembling hand, fluttering uselessly to the stone patio. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as the specific mention of the community center registered in his panicked brain. And Reverend Renee continued delivering the fatal, inescapable hook with ruthless corporate efficiency. We found out exactly how you covered up the $250,000 you stole from Maya's trust. Renee did not wait for my father to recover his breath. She stood in the center of the patio holding the manila folders like a loaded weapon. The bright Georgia sun beat down on her crimson suit, but she looked entirely immune to the heat. She opened the top folder, and the crisp sound of the heavy paper snapping back commanded the attention of every single person in the yard. Reverend Renee began, her voice ringing with the polished projection of a seasoned trial lawyer. A team at Vanguard Defense and Analytics initiated a forensic accounting sweep of your central financial network 21 days ago. We traced the exact trajectory of the $250,000 you unlawfully diverted from Maya's trust fund. You knew the annual family accountant meeting was approaching at the end of the fiscal year. You panicked. You needed to replenish the stolen trust funds before the independent auditors noticed the glaring deficit and triggered an automatic federal inquiry into your household finances. Renee flipped to the second page. Her eyes scanned the data with cold precision. To hide the theft, you executed a series of desperate financial maneuvers. You could not simply generate $250,000 in clean cash without raising massive red flags within the church treasury. So you went to a private commercial lender. You quietly took out a massive second mortgage on this exact estate. My mother gasped loudly. Vivian stumbled back against the outdoor bar, clutching her chest as if she had just been shot. The pristine facade of her wealthy, untouchable lifestyle shattered instantly. She stared at Jeremiah with wide, terrified eyes. "You mortgaged my home!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "You told me those banking documents were just routine tax adjustments. You put a lien on the house I built to cover up Chloe's massive debts." Jeremiah glared at his wife, his face twisting with rage. "Be quiet, Vivian," he snapped, completely dropping the gentle, loving husband persona he had performed for the crowd all afternoon. "I did what I had to do to protect the image of this family." But Renee was not finished. She did not let them bicker. She cut right through their domestic dispute with the surgical strike of her next revelation. "The estate was not enough," Renee stated firmly, her voice slicing through Vivian's frantic sobbing, "because of your existing debts and Chloe's ongoing luxury car leases, which you were also secretly funding. The bank deemed your personal assets insufficient to secure the cash you needed. You required a much larger collateral base to satisfy the underwriters." Renee pulled a thick, highly detailed property deed from the folder and held it up for the entire yard to see. The state seal was clearly visible on the top right corner. "You needed a commercial asset." Renee continued, looking directly at the group of church elders who were now listening with horrifying realization dawning on their faces. "So you leveraged the church property. You used your executive pastoral privilege to bypass the standard committee voting protocols. You forged the signatures of two absent board members, and you put up the newly built church community center as the primary collateral for your personal high-interest loan." The reaction from this crowd was instantaneous and explosive. The collective gasp from the deacons sounded like all the air had been violently sucked out of the backyard. Deacon Washington dropped his hands to his sides, his face trembling with a mixture of profound grief and escalating fury. He took a heavy step toward my father, ignoring the social etiquette of the engagement party entirely. "The community center," Deacon Washington asked, his voice shaking with raw emotional devastation. "Jeremiah, we spent 5 years raising the money for that building. The congregation held bake sales, car washes, and charity drives. Single mothers in this community gave their last $10 on Sunday mornings so our youth would have a safe place to go after school. Our seniors used that facility for their daily health clinics. You took the sanctuary we built with our own sweat and tears, and you gambled it away to pay for your daughter's fraudulent medical spa." The outrage rippled through the guests like a shockwave. The wealthy socialites who had donated massive sums to the community center construction fund were now glaring at Jeremiah with absolute disgust. The narrative of the generous, noble pastor was completely dead. He was no longer a spiritual leader guiding his flock. He was a common predator who had fed off the very people he swore to protect. This betrayal cut deeper than any simple financial crime. In the Black community, the church is the cornerstone of survival and progress. The community center was a beacon of hope, a tangible symbol of generational progress and collective uplift. To risk that sacred space for the sake of covering up a spoiled daughter's luxury debts was the ultimate unforgivable sin. Jeremiah saw the absolute hatred burning in the eyes of his most loyal followers. The panic he had been trying to suppress finally boiled over into sheer, unadulterated madness. His mind snapped under the immense crushing weight of public exposure. He could not spin this. He could not preach his way out of this corner. He lunged forward. Jeremiah threw his massive frame across the limestone patio, charging directly at Renee. His arms reached out wildly, his hands clawing toward the manila folders. He wanted to physically destroy the evidence, to rip the paper to shreds, as if tearing the documents would somehow erase the digital records stored on secure federal servers. "Give me those files!" Jeremiah roared, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. "You have no right to look at those. That is confidential church business. You are violating my privacy. Give them to me right now." He expected Renee to flinch. He expected her to drop the folders and cower in fear of his aggressive physical intimidation. He severely underestimated the woman standing in front of him. Renee did not panic. She did not scream for help. She executed a perfectly timed, smooth tactical pivot. She simply stepped back and to the side, allowing Jeremiah's own aggressive momentum to carry him forward. Jeremiah stumbled clumsily, grabbing nothing but empty air. He nearly tripped over a decorative stone planter, his expensive leather shoes scraping harshly against the patio tiles as he scrambled to catch his balance. Renee stood completely untouched, holding the files securely against her chest. She looked at him with an expression of pure clinical pity. "Do not ever step toward me again," Renee warned, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "I am not your congregation, and I am certainly not your family. I will press assault charges before you even hit the ground." Jeremiah stood panting, his chest heaving with exertion and terror. He turned his wild, desperate eyes toward me, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You cannot do this to me, Maya," he shouted, his voice cracking with a pathetic, shrill edge. "I am the senior pastor. The church finances are protected by religious exemption laws. You have no legal jurisdiction to interfere with confidential church business. I will have my lawyers bury your company in litigation for the rest of your natural life." I watched him hyperventilate. I watched the sweat pour down his face, ruining his pristine image. I stepped smoothly between him and Renee, shielding my chief operating officer from any further aggressive outbursts. I stepped directly into my father's personal space, forcing him to look me squarely in the eyes. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I dropped my voice to a lethal, razor-sharp whisper, ensuring that only he and the deacons standing right behind him could hear the final, devastating blow. "It was confidential church business, Dad." I whispered my words, sliding into his ears like poison. "You managed to keep the secret perfectly safe for almost a month. The bank was completely happy to collect the massive interest payments on your fraudulent loan." I tilted my head, watching his pupils dilate with raw, unfiltered terror. "Until the state medical board suspended Chloe's business license." I continued, maintaining intense, unbroken eye contact. "Until the bank's automated risk assessment algorithms flagged the sudden wire fraud investigation linked to your primary beneficiary. The bank realized you tied a high-interest commercial loan to a failing fraudulent medical spa. They deemed your entire portfolio a catastrophic high-risk liability." Jeremiah stopped breathing. The reality of corporate banking was crashing down on his pastoral illusions. "Banks do not like high-risk liabilities, Dad," I said softly, savoring the absolute destruction of his empire. "So they sold the debt, they packaged your second mortgage and the lien on the community center, and they auctioned it off to a private corporate acquisitions firm to wipe their hands clean of your mess." I took one final step forward, closing the trap permanently. "And guess which corporate entity just bought it out?" Jeremiah stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The realization hit him like a massive, unstoppable freight train, colliding directly with his fragile ego. The air in the sprawling backyard seemed to evaporate entirely, leaving him gasping for breath in the heavy, unforgiving Georgia humidity. The aggressive, towering patriarch who had commanded thousands from his elevated pulpit was suddenly completely stripped of his voice. He looked down at the expensive limestone patio beneath his feet, then back up at the cold, unyielding expression on my face. The terrifying reality of his situation was finally crashing down on his shoulders. Vanguard Defense owned his debt. I owned his debt. I owned the very estate we were currently standing in. I watched his broad chest heave as he struggled to process the absolute shift in power. He had spent his entire adult life building a lavish kingdom on a foundation of intimidation, manipulation, and financial smoke and mirrors. He had willingly leveraged his own family, drained my grandmother's sacred trust, and recklessly gambled away the church's sanctuary just to maintain the illusion of generational wealth. He had treated me like a disposable asset, a convenient scapegoat to elevate his golden child. And now the daughter he had ruthlessly thrown away held the legal deed to his entire fraudulent existence. Deacon Washington stepped forward, breaking the suffocating silence. He did not look at Jeremiah with the quiet reverence of a loyal, submissive follower. He looked at the man with the cold, absolute disgust of a shepherd who had just discovered a wolf feasting inside his own home. "You risked the community center," Deacon Washington said, his voice trembling with a profound, righteous anger that commanded the attention of every remaining guest. "You took the safe haven we built for our children, the sanctuary we built for our seniors, and you put it on the chopping block to pay for your daughter's illegal wire fraud. You stood up there and looked us in the eye every single Sunday. You preached to us about sacrifice, about community uplift, and about financial responsibility, while you were bleeding us dry in the dark." Jeremiah raised a shaking hand, desperately trying to summon the pastoral authority that had always shielded him from accountability. "Brother Washington, please. You have to understand the immense pressure I was under to protect this family. The enemy attacks the leaders of the flock the hardest. The Lord knows my true heart. We can fix this together. We can go into my study and pray on this right now." "Do not dare use the Lord to cover your theft," Deacon Rollins snapped, stepping up right beside Washington to form a united front against their former leader. "The Lord did not forge Maya's signature on those banking documents. The Lord did not falsify commercial loan applications to secure high-interest cash. You did that. You betrayed this entire community for your own selfish pride and your obsession with looking rich." Deacon Washington pulled his phone from his tailored suit pocket. He did not break his furious eye contact with my father. "I am contacting the rest of the Executive Council right now. We are calling an emergency board meeting effective immediately. We are freezing your access to all church accounts, and we are initiating the formal legal process to strip you of your pastoral duties. You are finished, Jeremiah. You will never step foot behind that pulpit again." "You cannot do this to me!" Jeremiah shouted, his voice cracking wildly as panic fully consumed him. "I built that congregation from the ground up. I brought the wealthy donors to the pews. I put this church on the map. You need me. We need a leader with actual integrity," Deacon Washington replied coldly. "And you have none." The two senior deacons turned their backs on my father. It was a simple, synchronized movement, but it carried the devastating weight of a public execution. They walked away, heading straight for the wrought iron gates of the estate, absolutely refusing to spend another second in his toxic presence. The abrupt departure of the highly respected church elders acted as a massive, undeniable signal to the rest of the wealthy guests. The pristine illusion of the perfect pious family shattered completely into a million jagged pieces right there on the grass. The wealthy local socialites, the exact people my mother had spent decades trying to impress with her lavish cookouts and designer dresses, were actively pulling out their phones. I could hear the rapid, frantic tapping of manicured nails on glass screens echoing across the patio. The scandal was already spreading across Atlanta's elite networks at lightning speed. Text messages were flying to other church members, rival pastors, country club presidents, and local politicians. The news that Jeremiah was a common fraud and that Chloe was facing a federal indictment for wire fraud was going viral in their exclusive circles before the sun could even begin to set. "Please, everyone, stop!" Jeremiah begged, spinning around in a frantic circle, his arms outstretched as he watched his kingdom desert him. This is just a private family dispute that has gotten out of hand. Do not spread these vicious lies. We are handling this internally. Please stay and eat. Nobody listened to him. The enabling aunties and uncles who had just been laughing at his cruel jokes about my military service were now gathering their expensive purses and shuffling rapidly toward the exit. They kept their heads down, deliberately avoiding making eye contact with me. They had blindly followed the loudest, most abusive voice in the room for years, enabling his toxic behavior because it was easier than standing up for the truth. Now that the truth had violently kicked the door down and exposed the rot, they were scattering like roaches hitting the light. Jeremiah stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the custom outdoor grill. He looked at the mass exodus happening in his own backyard. The grand, untouchable empire he had sacrificed my mental health and my financial future to build was evaporating into thin air. His wealthy friends were abandoning him. His church leadership had excommunicated him. His designated scapegoat had just orchestrated his total financial ruin. He slumped against the brick facade of his mansion, a hollow, broken, and utterly defeated man. Vivian watched the socialites rushing out the gates in absolute horror. She watched her husband collapse against the brick wall, utterly powerless to stop the bleeding. She looked down at Chloe, who was still weeping uncontrollably on the grass, her pristine white sundress completely ruined by dirt and spilled champagne, her Navy SEAL fiancé long gone. The terrifying reality of their situation crashed down on Vivian with inescapable, suffocating force. They were not just facing social ruin and embarrassment. The state medical board had officially revoked Chloe's business license. Connor's mandatory military background check had permanently exposed the phantom money and the dummy corporations. I held the irrefutable certified proof of their identity theft, and Vanguard Defense owned the commercial debt they had fraudulently secured using stolen assets. They were facing imminent, unavoidable prison time, the total loss of their high society status, and immediate catastrophic bankruptcy. Vivian's perfectly curated facade broke completely. The arrogant, condescending matriarch who had spent the entire afternoon tearing down my military service was suddenly staring into the terrifying, bottomless abyss of her own actions. The house she was standing behind was no longer hers. The money she had spent was never hers. The daughter she had elevated was a felon. She moved toward me. Her designer heels scraped harshly against the limestone patio. Her heavy pearl necklace clattered against her chest as her breathing became ragged and shallow. She did not walk with her usual aggressive, confident purpose. She stumbled, her knees physically giving out just as she reached the space directly in front of where I stood beside Renee. Vivian dropped to her knees right beside her sobbing golden child. The rough stone scraped against her bare legs, but she did not seem to care about the pain or the indignity of her position. She looked up at me from the ground, her immaculate makeup running in dark, messy streaks down her cheeks as hot, desperate tears streamed freely from her eyes. She reached out with trembling, frantic hands, grasping for the tailored fabric of my dark linen suit. She looked up at the daughter she had treated like a worthless outsider for a decade, fully realizing that I held the absolute power of life and death over her entire future. She opened her mouth, preparing to play her final desperate card. Vivian's knees slammed onto the hard limestone patio with a sickening thud. The harsh impact tore through the delicate fabric of her tailored peach designer dress, but she did not even flinch. The flawless, untouchable matriarch of Atlanta high society, the woman who had spent the entire afternoon gliding across the manicured grass like royalty, was completely gone. In her place was a frantic, terrified woman staring directly into the terrifying abyss of federal prison, total financial ruin, and permanent social exile. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, moving rapidly across the very same patio where she had just hosted her golden child's lavish engagement cookout. Her heavy pearl necklace swung violently, clattering against her chest as she closed the distance between us. Before I could take a step back, her hands shot out. Her perfectly manicured fingers, the same fingers she had used to dismiss my entire existence for over a decade, clamped desperately onto the crisp hem of my dark linen trousers. She gripped the fabric so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark, absolute white. She looked up at me from the ground, her immaculate airbrushed makeup completely destroyed. Thick dark streaks of mascara and eyeliner ran down her cheeks, mixing with the heavy tears and the pouring sweat of the suffocating Georgia heat. She was weeping loudly, gasping for breath, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her pristine social dignity. "Maya, please," Vivian sobbed, her voice breaking into a harsh, ragged wail that echoed across the dead, silent backyard. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to call off the auditors. You cannot do this to your own family. We are your flesh and blood. You know how hard your father and I worked to build this life. You know what it takes to build an empire in this city. Black families need to stick together in this harsh world, Maya. The system is already designed to tear us down, to rip away our generational wealth and to see us fail. You cannot be the one to hand them the sword. We are all we have. Blood is thicker than water." She was weaponizing our culture, weaponizing the very real systemic struggles of our community, and using it as a desperate human shield to cover up her own blatant, premeditated felonies. She clung to my pants, shaking her head frantically as she continued her barrage of emotional manipulation. "We will pay you back," Vivian pleaded, her voice pitching higher into a frantic, breathless shriek. "Every single penny. We will sell the luxury cars. We will liquidate the remaining church discretionary funds. I will personally work every day for the rest of my life to restore your trust account. Just forgive the debt, Maya. Tell your corporate attorneys to drop the foreclosure. Tell the state auditors you authorized the transfer as a business loan to your sister. We can fix this quietly. We can go inside right now, sit down as a family, and draw up a private repayment contract. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not destroy your father. Do not put your own sister in a federal penitentiary. Please, Maya. Blood is thicker than water." I stood perfectly still, letting her desperate, pathetic bargaining ring out across the yard. The heavy, oppressive humidity of the July afternoon felt as though it was pressing down on us, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, crystalline clarity. For 34 years, this woman had wielded her maternal authority like a blunt instrument, bludgeoning my self-esteem, invalidating my military service, and constantly demanding that I shrink myself so Chloe could shine. She had watched my father publicly humiliate me mere hours ago and had proudly joined in the slaughter. Now, because the balance of power had violently shifted, she wanted to invoke the sacred bond of family. I looked down at her hands, gripping my trousers. I did not yell, I did not kick her away, nor did I raise my voice to match her hysterical, frantic energy. I simply reached down, placed my hands firmly over hers, and peeled her manicured fingers off my clothing. I gently but firmly pulled my leg away from her grasp, taking one slow, deliberate step backward. The physical detachment mirrored the absolute emotional severance I had achieved. I looked down at the three people who had made my life a living hell. Chloe was still curled into a sobbing, ruined ball on the grass, her engagement ring gone, her fraudulent business exposed, and her high-status military fiancé halfway back to his base. Jeremiah was slumped against the brick wall of the massive estate, sweating profusely, staring blankly at the ground, as the reality of his excommunication and impending bankruptcy short-circuited his narcissistic brain. And Vivian was weeping at my feet, a broken, desperate shell of the arrogant socialite she had been just 30 minutes prior. I looked at these people who had treated me like an outcast, a designated scapegoat, and a perpetual failure for over a decade. I looked at the people who had stolen my financial safety net to fund their own luxury aesthetic while I was working 80-hour weeks building a massive corporate defense firm from the ground up. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering obligation. The invisible chains of familial duty had been permanently shattered the moment I read that state compliance report. I squared my shoulders, my military posture locking into place, and I addressed her pleas methodically, stripping away every single layer of her pathetic, manipulative hypocrisy. "Blood is thicker than water," I asked, my voice dropping into a low, lethal register that sliced cleanly through her sobbing. "That is a very convenient proverb for you to remember today, Mom. It is truly fascinating how family solidarity only becomes your priority when you are the one staring down the barrel of a federal indictment." I took a step closer, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact with me. I wanted her to hear every single syllable of her own condemnation. "Blood didn't stop you from stealing my future," I stated, my words striking her like physical blows. You and Dad sat in a bank manager's office, looked a financial officer dead in the eye, and forged my signature on legal documents. You drained $250,000 from the irrevocable trust my grandmother left specifically for me, knowing exactly how hard I was working to build my own life. You bypassed the executor by fabricating a story about a terminal medical emergency. You used the sacred bond of family to commit identity theft against your own daughter. You did not think about Black families sticking together when you were funneling my stolen inheritance into a dummy corporation. Vivian opened her mouth to argue, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks, but I did not give her a single second to speak. I raised my hand, silencing her with the sheer crushing authority of my presence. Blood didn't stop you from calling a decorated veteran a coward in front of strangers. I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper. I spent years in the United States Marine Corps serving in active combat zones. I pulled my men out of a burning compound in Fallujah while taking enemy fire. I sacrificed my own honorable public record to protect a classified mission. I survived things that would have broken you and Dad in 5 seconds. And yet for the last 10 years, you stood by and smiled while Dad stood at his pulpit and at every social gathering branding me a failure. You stood on this very patio today and watched him tell a Navy SEAL commander that I abandoned my squad. You weaponized my service and twisted it into a joke just to make Chloe look better. You did not protect your own in this house. You sacrificed me on the altar of your own ego. Vivian was shaking violently now, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist as she rocked back and forth on the limestone patio. She was completely out of ammunition. The religious guilt trips, the racial solidarity arguments, and the maternal manipulation tactics were utterly useless against the fortified wall of my absolute truth. Blood didn't stop you from using me to fund her luxury lifestyle, I said, shifting my gaze briefly to Chloe, who was still weeping into the grass before locking back onto my mother. You mortgaged this estate. You leveraged the church community center. You risked the financial sanctuary of thousands of hardworking families in our congregation just so Chloe could drive a luxury car and pretend to be a successful medical spa owner. You sold out your own community to fund a lie, and you used my stolen money to pay the initial cover-up. Do not dare look up at me right now and speak about the struggles of our people when you are the very predator bleeding them dry. The remaining guests who had not yet fled the backyard were standing in stunned, captivated silence. The absolute, unvarnished truth of my words resonated through the humid summer air, leaving no room for misinterpretation. There was no defense against the certified facts. The Golden family of Atlanta was nothing but a criminal enterprise built on vanity theft and relentless gaslighting, and the daughter they had thrown away had just handed the entire city the unredacted receipts. "We are sorry," Vivian wailed, her voice cracking into a hoarse, desperate whisper. "We were wrong, Maya. We were so incredibly wrong. Just give us a chance to make it right. Please, we will do anything. We will sign whatever you want. Just do not take the house. Do not send us to prison. I am your mother. You cannot do this to your mother." "You are not my mother," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotional attachment. "You are just a woman who gave birth to me, and then spent 34 years trying to make me pay for the crime of not being exactly like you. You made your choices, Vivian. You chose your luxury aesthetic over my safety. You chose Chloe's fraudulent business over my trust fund. You chose your husband's massive ego over my dignity. And now you get to live with the exact, unforgiving consequences of those choices." I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic, weeping excuse. I had spent enough of my life listening to their lies, their justifications, and their cruel, unrelenting criticisms. I was completely finished engaging with the emotional terrorism they called parenting. The time for talking had officially expired. The time for execution had arrived. I turned my body away from my sobbing mother and looked directly at Renee. My chief operating officer stood a few feet away, her tailored crimson suit standing out vividly against the backdrop of the shattered engagement party. She had watched the entire exchange with the quiet, calculating patience of a legal sniper, waiting for the exact right moment to take the final shot. She held the thick stack of manila folders securely against her chest, her dark, analytical eyes locked onto mine. I gave her a single definitive nod. Give them the final paperwork, I commanded, my voice carrying the crisp, absolute authority of a corporate chief executive finalizing a hostile takeover. Renee did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She stepped forward with immaculate predatory grace. She bypassed Vivian, who was still kneeling and weeping on the ground, and walked directly toward the custom outdoor patio table. Renee reached into the top manila folder. She did not pull out a massive, complicated legal contract or a dense multi-page financial document. She pulled out a single, heavily laminated sheet of crisp, bright white paper. The state seal was stamped prominently at the top, and the bold, black, undeniable legal text was visible even from a distance. She held the document for a moment, ensuring that Jeremiah, who was watching her every move from his slumped position against the brick wall, could clearly see the official nature of the paperwork. Then, with a smooth, effortless motion, Renee dropped the single laminated sheet of paper directly onto the patio table. The heavy laminate landed with a sharp, definitive slap against the stone surface, coming to rest right next to the shattered, jagged pieces of the broken champagne glass. It was the final, inescapable nail in the coffin of their fraudulent empire. The document sat there gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun, broadcasting their absolute total destruction to anyone who dared to read the bold black ink. The silence that followed the sound of that single sheet of paper hitting the table was heavier than anything that had come before it. It was the sound of a dynasty ending. It was the sound of decades of generational trauma, financial abuse, and relentless, suffocating gaslighting finally being terminated with extreme prejudice. I did not need to explain what the document was. The sheer terror radiating from my parents told me that they already knew exactly what Renee had just served them. It was the physical manifestation of the boundary I had drawn in the sand, a boundary fortified by an army of corporate attorneys, federal auditors, and the uncompromising strength I had forged in the military. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the heavy, oppressive Georgia heat slide off my shoulders for the very first time in my entire life. The backyard of the sprawling estate, a place that had always felt like a beautiful, terrifying prison of impossible expectations, suddenly just looked like a piece of commercial real estate waiting to be liquidated. I looked at the sobbing women on the grass and the broken patriarch against the wall, and I felt nothing but the clean, sterile emptiness of a closed account. The transaction was complete. The debt was called in. The Black Panther had finally come home, not to seek permission to sit at their table, but to buy the entire building and evict the tenants. The reign of the Golden Child and the untouchable megachurch pastor was officially permanently over-silenced by the very daughter they had tried to bury. The laminated sheet of paper lay on the custom outdoor patio table, catching the blinding glare of the late afternoon Georgia sun. It rested right next to the jagged shards of the crystal champagne flute that Connor had dropped just moments before. The stark white background of the legal document contrasted violently with the spilled expensive liquor soaking into the polished stone. Jeremiah stared down at the paper as if it were a live explosive device. His breathing was heavy and ragged. His broad chest heaved under his sweat-soaked linen suit. He did not want to touch it. He knew that picking up that piece of paper would make the nightmare completely real. He knew that the moment his fingers brushed against the laminated surface, his entire kingdom would officially cease to exist. I watched him struggle with the physical reality of his defeat. For my entire life, he had been the untouchable patriarch of our family and our community. He had dictated every rule handed out, every punishment, and controlled every single narrative. He had demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him while secretly drowning in his own financial corruption. Now he was just a terrified old man staring at a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction and foreclosure. Renee stood perfectly still beside the table, her crimson suit immaculate, her posture radiating absolute corporate authority. She did not offer him a pen. She did not provide a comforting explanation. She simply waited with the cold patience of an executioner. Jeremiah finally reached out. His large hands, the same hands that had gripped the wooden edges of his megachurch pulpit for decades, were trembling uncontrollably. He picked up the document. His eyes darted across the bold black ink. I could see his lips moving silently as he read the unmistakable legal terminology. The header bore the official seal of the State Real Estate Commission alongside the unmistakable corporate logo of Vanguard Defense and Analytics. The document outlined the immediate transfer of the property deed, the acceleration of his defaulted commercial loan, and the formal demand for the premises to be vacated. He read the document once, then he read it again. The heavy laminated paper shook in his grasp. The deep, rich brown of his skin turned a sickly grayish hue. The reality hit him with the crushing, inescapable force of a freight train. He did not just owe money. He had lost the very ground he was standing on. The sprawling Atlanta estate with its manicured lawns, custom outdoor kitchens, and massive iron gates no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the corporate entity I controlled. I owned the roof over his head. I owned the dirt under his expensive leather shoes. I owned his debt. Vivian remained frozen on the patio stones, her knees ruined, her designer peach dress stained and torn. She stared up at her husband, waiting for him to unleash some hidden reserve of power to shout down the attorneys and banish me from the yard. She waited for the commanding pastor to save her social empire. But Jeremiah did not speak. The paper slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered back onto the table. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish my dominance. The quiet, steady cadence of my words carried a lethal, undeniable weight. "You have 30 days to vacate my property," I stated, my voice slicing cleanly through the humid summer air. Jeremiah flinched as if I had physically struck him. Vivian let out a soft, wounded gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father, ensuring he understood the absolute finality of my terms. "This is not a negotiation, Dad. This is a directive. You will pack your personal belongings, and you will leave this estate. If you are not gone by the 1st of the month, I will initiate the final stage of the foreclosure. I will dispatch my private security teams to seize the property, and I will have you physically escorted off the premises by local law enforcement." I paused, letting the devastating reality of a forced public eviction settle into his panicked mind. I wanted him to picture the flashing police lights illuminating his circular driveway. I wanted him to imagine his wealthy neighbors, the same people he had preached to for years, pulling back their curtains to watch the disgraced pastor being thrown out onto the street. "And if you decide to fight me on this," I continued, my tone dropping into a cold, mechanical register, "I will hand the unredacted wire fraud and identity theft files directly to the district attorney. I have the certified banking records, the forged signature analysis, and the digital timestamps of your illegal transfers. I have everything required to secure a federal indictment for both you and Chloe." The air in the backyard felt impossibly heavy. The distant hum of the cicadas seemed to amplify the crushing silence that followed my ultimatum. I laid out their future with surgical precision. "If you attempt to delay the eviction, if you try to file a frivolous injunction, or if you try to leverage your remaining contacts in this city to manipulate the narrative, I will release the complete audit to the press. The local news stations will have a field day with the senior pastor who mortgaged his congregation community center to fund his daughter's fraudulent medical spa. You will not just lose this house, you will lose your freedom. You will spend the rest of your natural life sitting in a federal penitentiary." The sheer magnitude of my threat finally broke the last remaining pillar of their psychological defense. Chloe, who had been sobbing quietly on the grass, suddenly let out a visceral, blood-curdling scream. It was not the practiced theatrical cry she used to garner sympathy from our mother. It was the raw, terrifying shriek of a woman who had just watched her entire universe completely implode. She thrashed wildly against the manicured lawn, her arms flailing as she tore at the grass. Her pristine white sundress was now smeared with dirt, grass stains, and spilled liquor. The perfect airbrushed makeup she had spent hours applying was entirely ruined, leaving her face a smeared, chaotic mess of dark mascara and foundation. "My life is over!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking and tearing as she pounded her fists against the ground. "My life is completely over. Connor is gone. He is never coming back. My business is gone." She rolled onto her side, pulling her knees to her chest, weeping with a wild, primal desperation. She had spent her entire existence defining her self-worth through external validation, through expensive cars, high-status relationships, and the adoration of Atlanta elite socialites. Without the medical spa to legitimize her professional aesthetic, without the Navy SEAL fiancé to elevate her social standing, and without the massive estate to host her lavish parties, she was absolutely nothing. Her entire identity had been instantly permanently erased. She cried out for our mother, begging Vivian to fix it, begging her to turn back the clock. But Vivian could not comfort her. Vivian was too busy drowning in her own catastrophic reality. She realized she would have to face her wealthy friends, her country club associates, and the church congregation as a disgraced homeless fraud. The social status she valued more than her own children had been completely vaporized. Jeremiah did not look at his weeping wife or his thrashing golden child. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The massive, commanding physical presence he had maintained for decades dissolved into nothingness. He looked like an empty, hollow shell. He turned slowly, his movements stiff and uncoordinated like a machine running out of power. He dragged his feet across the limestone patio, walking toward a heavy wrought iron patio chair sitting in the shade of a large oak tree. He did not look back at me. He collapsed heavily into the chair, the metal legs scraping harshly against the stone under his dead weight. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and buried his face entirely in his large, trembling hands. I was a broken, defeated man. The empire he had built on a foundation of manipulation, theft, and cruelty had collapsed directly onto his own head. There were no sermons left to preach. There were no wealthy donors left to manipulate. The flock had scattered, the sanctuary was compromised, and the daughter he had designated as his lifelong scapegoat had executed a flawless, total corporate takeover. I stood in the center of the patio, flanked by my chief operating officer, looking out over the absolute wreckage of their toxic empire. I watched my sister hyperventilating on the dirt. I watched my mother weeping silently on her knees. I watched my father hiding his face in shame. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I did not throw my head back and laugh at their misery. I did not gloat or smile or dance on the ashes of their destruction. The victory did not require theatrical celebration. The victory was in the profound, undeniable silence of my total independence. For years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to convince me that my military service was a failure, that my survival was a source of shame, and that my existence was a burden to their perfect image. I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of their impossible expectations until it nearly broke my spirit. But the fire of combat had burned away my need for their validation. The grueling, harsh reality of war had taught me exactly what true strength looked like. I looked at my father sitting in the shadows of the estate I now owned. I did not raise my voice. The quiet, steady rhythm of my words carried across the yard with the unstoppable force of a rising tide. I survived Fallujah. Dad, I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely unbothered. He did not lift his head from his hands, but I saw his broad shoulders tense at the sound of my voice. I looked at the incredible destruction surrounding him, the shattered glass, the ruined engagement, the weeping women, and the absolute finality of the eviction notice resting on the table. Did you really think you could break me in Atlanta? I turned my back on the wreckage. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing left for them to say, and nothing left for me to hear. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored dark linen suit, feeling the warm afternoon breeze brush against my skin. I signaled Renee with a brief nod, indicating that our business at the estate was officially concluded. We walked together across the patio, our footsteps synchronized and steady. We passed the weeping matriarch and the thrashing sister, completely ignoring their desperate presence. We walked down the long, winding driveway toward the heavy iron gates, leaving the toxic, suffocating history of that household permanently behind us. The black luxury SUV was waiting right outside the perimeter, the engine idling smoothly. I stepped into the cool, quiet interior of the vehicle, leaning back against the plush leather seat. As the driver pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the flowing city traffic, I looked out the tinted window. The heavy iron gates of my former prison faded into the distance, disappearing entirely from my view. The mission was accomplished. The target was neutralized. I was finally completely free. I did not wait for my father to lift his head from his trembling hands. I did not wait for my mother to stop weeping on the ruined limestone patio, or for my sister to cease her frantic animalistic thrashing against the grass. The symphony of their absolute destruction echoed loudly around me, a chaotic, pathetic blend of panicked gasps, heavy, wet sobs, and the sharp crunch of expensive, shattered crystal underfoot. For my entire life, the sound of my family distress would have triggered an immediate, deeply ingrained trauma response. I would have rushed forward to fix the problem, to absorb the blame, to apologize for breathing the wrong way, just to restore their artificial peace. But today, standing in the blistering afternoon sun, their noise did not penetrate my spirit. Their panic did not trigger my instinct to shrink. I simply turned my back on the entire grotesque spectacle. I reached up with steady, confident hands and smoothly adjusted the sharp lapels of my dark linen suit jacket. The heavy, suffocating weight of being the family disappointment, the designated failure, and the perpetual scapegoat slide off my shoulders completely. It pooled on the patio stones right next to the formal eviction notice, leaving me feeling lighter than air. I caught the eye of my chief operating officer. Renee stood perfectly composed in her vivid crimson suit, her analytical dark eyes sweeping the devastated yard one final time to ensure no further threats remained. I gave her a single definitive nod. We were entirely done here. The transaction was officially closed, the audit was finalized, and the account was permanently sealed. I began my descent from the elevated patio down to the sprawling manicured lawn. My posture was military rigid, my strides long, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. I moved with the immaculate, terrifying silence of an apex predator who had just finished a necessary hunt. The backyard, which had previously been packed shoulder to shoulder with Atlanta, most elite black socialites, powerful municipal politicians, and influential megachurch deacons, suddenly felt incredibly vast and cavernous. As my leather shoes stepped onto the bright green grass, a remarkable physical shift occurred across the yard. The guests did not just politely step aside, they practically scrambled out of my path. Men and women in their expensive summer linens and custom-tailored suits pressed themselves backward against the outdoor bars, the stone planters, and the decorative hedges, desperate to clear a wide berth for me. The crowd parted for me exactly like the Red Sea. I walked straight down the middle of the newly formed pathway. I kept my chin perfectly level, my eyes focused dead ahead on the heavy wrought iron gates at the far end of the property. I could feel the intense burning heat of hundreds of stares locked onto my back. There were no more whispers of pity or condescension. There were no more mocking chuckles about the troubled broke veteran who could not make it in the real world. Instead, the humid air crackled with a potent, electric mixture of raw awe and absolute undeniable respect. The very same people who had watched my father publicly humiliate me an hour ago were now holding their breath, genuinely terrified to even make a sound as I passed by them. They were looking at a woman who had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt multi-million-dollar religious empire without ever raising her voice or losing her composure. I did not look left or right. I did not offer them a triumphant smile, and I did not give them a vindictive glare. Their sudden desperate respect meant as little to me as their previous scorn. I was operating on a completely different frequency, existing in a realm of power they could not even begin to comprehend. The heavy wrought iron gates loomed ahead of me, serving as the final physical barrier between my toxic, abusive past and my unlimited, unburdened future. I walked through the grand entryway, crossing the threshold and leaving the sprawling, fraudulent estate entirely behind me. The harsh, chaotic noise of the backyard instantly gave way to the serene, muffled quiet of the exclusive tree-lined suburban street. The massive, ancient oak trees cast long, cooling shadows across the immaculate black pavement. Parked flawlessly at the curb, its powerful engine idling with a low, steady hum, was my customized armored black SUV. The vehicle looked like a sleek, impenetrable fortress on wheels, a perfect physical reflection of the secure, independent life I had built for myself from the ground up. Renee seamlessly overtook me, her heels clicking sharply and rhythmically on the asphalt as she reached the vehicle first. She opened the heavy, bulletproof rear door for me with crisp professional efficiency. I stepped up and slid gracefully into the plush, pristine leather seat. The interior of the SUV was a sanctuary of climate-controlled perfection, instantly sealing away the oppressive, suffocating Georgia humidity. I settled deep into the luxurious leather, feeling the cool, filtered air wash over my face and relax my muscles. I reached forward to the customized center console. I picked up a chilled crystal glass, poured myself a generous serving of crisp, sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold, clean liquid washed down my throat, effectively acting as a palate cleanser, washing away the bitter metallic taste of my family, ultimate betrayal. Renee closed the heavy rear door with a solid, definitive thud, shutting out the outside world completely. She walked briskly around the front of the vehicle and climbed into the passenger seat, issuing a quiet, immediate command to my private driver to proceed. The massive engine purred with hidden strength as the SUV smoothly pulled away from the curb, gliding effortlessly down the affluent, shaded street. I leaned my head back into the deep comfort of my headrest and turned my face slowly to the side. I looked out through the dark, heavily tinted window, watching the grand brick facade of my father's estate shrink rapidly into the distance. The towering white columns, the pristine landscaping, and the tall iron gates blurred together as the vehicle gained speed. I searched my heart and my mind for any lingering trace of bitterness, any residual ache of a daughter mourning the supportive parents she never truly had. I searched for the profound sadness that usually accompanies the death of a family unit. I found absolutely nothing. I did not feel a single ounce of anger anymore. The burning resentment that had fueled my grueling ascent through the corporate world, the desperation to prove them wrong, that had kept me awake during countless long nights, had completely evaporated. I just felt free. The suffocating heavy chains of generational trauma, financial abuse, and conditional love had been permanently severed by my own hand. The wounded, desperate girl who tried to earn her father's love by making herself small was officially, irrevocably gone. The convenient family scapegoat had been buried under a mountain of federal audits, compliance reports, and foreclosure notices. All that remained in that luxurious back seat was the woman forged in the relentless fires of overseas combat and polished to a diamond finish in the brutal, unforgiving arenas of corporate defense. The Black Panther remained untamed, undefeated, and entirely in control of her own magnificent destiny. I took another quiet, refreshing sip of my sparkling water, my breathing steady and incredibly deep. The sprawling estate vanished completely around the corner, leaving only the lush green canopy of the neighborhood in its wake. The screen of my life faded to black, settling perfectly on my calm, unbothered, and triumphant reflection, staring back at me from the dark glass of the tinted window. The powerful lesson embedded in this story is that true strength does not require volume or the validation of those committed to misunderstanding you. For years, Maya endured the toxic environment of her family, carrying the unfair burden of being the designated scapegoat. However, she refused to let their false narratives dictate her self-worth or her future. By silently building her own empire and maintaining her integrity, she boldly proved that ultimate power lies in self-reliance and unshakable truth. When faced with generational manipulation and gaslighting, walking away with your dignity and assets intact is the highest form of justice. If you found Maya's journey of breaking free from toxic family dynamics inspiring, hit that subscribe button and share your own stories of resilience in the comments below.